I'm Jana Wong Healy, and I've been a film industry professional for years, having worked in development, production, and distribution for a variety of film studios and companies. I currently teach business communication at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. I'm here with Stephen Gundel, a professor of film and television studies at the University of Warwick in the UK. His background is in history and politics, which he taught at Cambridge, Oxford, and London universities. He is an expert, especially on Italian cinema, and recently led a research project on Italian film producers. He is the author of several books, including Glamour, A History, Death and the Dolce Vita, and Mussolini's Dream Factory. His latest book, Fame Amid the Ruins, Italian Film Stardom in the Age of Neorealism. For the next few months, the two of us are going to be doing a deep dive into the works of film producer Dino De Laurentiis, 10 podcasts of Dino's Top 10. These will be conversations exploring his work and his international legacy. Okay, so let's get started, Stephen. Dino was such an interesting character with his childhood selling, pasta for his father's spaghetti factory, and then he floats over into film because he didn't really like selling pasta.
The idea of Dino as the son of a pasta manufacturer somehow conjures up the idea of a big factory producing packs and packs of pasta. In fact, it wasn't like that at all. In the area near Naples where he grew up, there were lots and lots of very small manufacturers, and his father was one of those. And the fact that he was relying on his son to go out and sell the product gives you an idea already that it was a pretty small-scale operation. Now, Dino didn't much like that job, but I think there was always something of the salesman about him. He understood that among the things a producer has to do, a really important thing is to get out there and sell the product, invest in the marketing, pay attention to the promotion. And I think that is something that he learned surely in his very early days. Another thing that I think is clear is that in those teenage years, perhaps even pre-teenage years, near Naples, he was going to the cinema a lot. If Dino De Laurentiis becomes a great showman later, it's rooted in an early experience of film going and a love of the movies. And I think the fact that, he made so many films that are remakes or revisitations of films from the past, from King Kong to Flash Gordon and so on, shows that he was drawing on his own heritage. And that idea of escaping from the pasta to get into the movies first becomes concrete when he enrolled in the Centro Sperimentale, the Italian film school that was set up in Rome in the early 1930s. And that's how he began, first as an actor before moving into a sort of, behind the scenes role that then evolved into being a producer.
His work as a producer spanned 70 years, and he produced over 500 films. What do you think he did to manage his career over such a long time in such an erratic and difficult business as filmmaking?
It is absolutely incredible, isn't it, when you consider the length of that career and also the ups and downs that he went through, because I think, when we consider 70 odd years in the movies, one can imagine that it's a long period full of success and triumph. And of course, there are plenty of those, but there are also dark periods, there are flops, there are things that go wrong. At a certain point, of course, he migrated from Italy to the United States, thinking he couldn't make the movies he wanted to, international movies, anymore in Italy. So there are lots of crises and moments of transition. I mean, he himself used to say that to work in the movies, you have to be a bit crazy. And I think what he meant by that was not that you have to, be sort of less than fully sane, but that you have to have an element of sort of fantasy. And an ability to dream, um, a capacity to take risks, a sense of your own purpose and the value of your own intuition. And I think for Dino De Laurentiis, who operated largely as an independent producer, ideas were always key.
Dino was a producer whose work spanned 70 years and over 500 films. How do you think he managed to stay in the business for so long?
Well, it is an extraordinary career, an extraordinary accomplishment. I mean, I think Dino produced around 150 films himself, and you get to a figure of 400 or 500 by adding in the various participations and co-productions. But the volume of work is extraordinary. And I think one has to recognize that it was a career marked also by crises, by dark periods, by transitions, by a move from one country to another. So it's not a sort of a constant march forward, a sort of a triumphal progress by any means. And there are lots of successes, some fantastic hits, films which everybody remembers: Hannibal, King Kong, Serpico, Ragtime, lots of them, but also flops and things that didn't quite work. I think Dino had a lot of things that helped him along the way. Being independent meant he had a flexibility that he wouldn't have had he been embedded in a studio. He also had a sense that people involved in the movie industry, including himself, needed to be, as he put it, a bit crazy. They needed to be able to draw on their resources of fantasy, their intuition, to follow an idea. And he often used to talk about the importance of the idea. And from an idea is born a story. And from the story, you can then start to put together a movie. And he used to say, you don't worry about the money. That's not the first thing. The first thing has to be the idea and then the story. And if the story is good, the money will follow. You can always find the money somewhere. So I think he had a very clear idea. He knew exactly and talked quite a lot about what a producer had to do, the sort of steps every producer had to take to go from the start to the finish. But his central focus was on the idea. And I think that's what kept him going, the idea. And of course, another quality that he used to talk about a lot, the passion.
Do you think that those two qualities are what kept him from working through a studio? He was such an independent producer in the true sense of the word. And do you think that those were the two ideals that he had that made him want to continue to be independent?
It's interesting because he operated. I mean, of course, he had collaborators, he had a team, but he used to think of movie making as a sort of one-man operation. In other words, the collaborators could change, the context could change, but he was the key element. Now, there were 2 points in his career where he tried to, and he succeeded in establishing studios himself. Outside Rome in the 1950s, he built a huge complex, which took its name from the Cinecittà studios in Rome, and he called them, his studios, Dinocittà. And for a period, Dinocittà worked very well as a center for the making of international films. And that was his idea. The films didn't need to be made in the Italian language, but in English, so they could immediately reach a wide export market. And then later in the 1980s, when he'd moved to the United States, he established in Wilmington, North Carolina, another studio complex and took to Wilmington the sort of the ascent of the industry, which survives today. It's still the biggest center outside of California, I think, of television and film production. So he knew studios. And if we think of the studio as a sort of a factory system of production, had their importance, but nonetheless, studios could be temporary. They were put up to meet the needs of a particular moment, whereas he could move on and reinvent himself and find other ways of making films, forging alliances, getting packages organized and, with distributors and so on. So each project was considered almost as unique to itself. I don't think really, even if you look at his time in the studios, I don't think you can say, well, here you've got a sort of production line system. He didn't seem to operate ever, I would say, within a genre system.
No, he didn't, because his movies are all very different, except for the period of the neo-realism right after World War II. He did something that I don't think happens anymore with producers, and that is he would launch into a production without even having the financing to do it. So how do you suppose he succeeded at that? That would scare me, I'll tell you.
It's certainly an aspect of his craziness, I think. He was always convinced that if the idea was good, you could get the money. I suppose it's a bit more complicated than that, of course, because from the idea you go to the story, from the story to the script, then you've got to get the director, you've got to get the stars. But he did say, there's a television interview where he said the number one star is the story. So if the story's good, you can even do without the star. But I think once he'd convinced himself that he was onto something, then he went to work to persuade the banks, to persuade the financiers, the distributors to invest in it. And because he himself became a personality, I won't say his name was a guarantee of success, but if you look at the record overall, there are far more successes than setbacks and failures. But if he believed in it and could persuade others that he believed in it, then he was pretty sure that he could get the finances, even if it meant going to a bank in Holland or, setting up distribution deals around the world. I think he used his fame because, his name was often up there, pretty well always. Dino De Laurentiis presents, so it wasn't that he was a shrinking violet. He wasn't in the background. If he was out there as a personality, then, that gave him a leverage which enabled him to put together the finance each time.
Would you say he is one of the film industry's first creative producers?
Well, it's interesting because, of course, producers have a terrible reputation, and especially the producers of the past, the movie moguls. They're often depicted as people lacking in education, lacking in cultural sensitivity, not looking much for nuance, and somehow they were seen as the least creative part of the movie making process. There's a famous book about Hollywood called The Genius of the System. The idea that somehow it's the system that is creative, not the producer as an individual. But of course, there are producers who've invested in talent, in creative artists who've produced extraordinary sort of, one-off films. And Dino De Laurentiis always saw himself as creative. His relationship with directors varied according to the individual concerned. Sometimes when he was dealing with directors he respected for their creativity, like Fellini in Italy, a notoriously difficult director to work with, somebody who didn't respect budgets or schedules at all, he was prepared to defer to that director's genius. But in other instances, he would intervene, and he always reserved the right, which is usual for a producer, to have or approve at least the final cut on a film. And my feeling is that if you look at the work as a whole, there are certain films where he wasn't able perhaps to intervene as creatively or as positively as he wanted to. Buffalo Bill, which was one of the flops that he made, is a case in point. But in general, he saw his role as bringing bringing a degree of creativity. He didn't see himself as an artist, but he saw himself as, bringing something to life out of nothing. And that involves creation by definition. So it would be difficult not to call him a creative producer. Although I think his reputation probably rests more on his capacity to make massive spectacles, colossal blockbusters, and one tends to think of those as not necessarily being the most creative type of movie that's made. But I think, the reality is that they involved a huge effort of creation, and a lot of that was down to Dino De Laurentiis.
You mentioned earlier that his name was everywhere, and I know that there were some films in his early years when he was working in Italy that journalists followed him everywhere, all the time, for months at a time. Do you think that he enjoyed being such a public personality? Do you think he fostered it? Do you think he didn't like it? What's your opinion about that?
It's not easy to judge. I think he was probably a more complex figure than many think. I think if you watch television interviews with him, you can see both a shy side and an exuberant side. He always preserved a certain Italianness. The accent was strong. There are the gestures, the hands, the arms. There's a colourful expression. He often talked about his love of food. One thing he retained from the family business was an interest in cooking. So, there's an extrovert dimension, certainly. And in Italy after the war, he was one of the first producers to drive an American automobile. Now, in Italy in the 1940s, there was not a lot of money around. Even the movies were made on a shoestring. Dino De Laurentiis was working for a company called Lux, and the boss of Lux was an industrialist called Riccardo Gualino. Gualino always drove around in a small car, kept a low profile, not a public personality at all, and Dino broke with that practice. So he got his American automobile. When he arrived, people knew he was arriving. When he was on set, it wasn't a matter of hanging around quietly in the background, but making his presence felt. And I think he understood early on that, that there's a leverage that comes from that, that publicity works like a sort of magnet in a way. It can turn nasty. It can present problems, questions of privacy and so on. And of course, he established a family home in a villa behind massive walls on the Via Appia Antica in Rome. But that sense, that strong drive towards constructing a public image, I think is something that he learned early and that followed him throughout his career.
He seemed to be a person who liked to take a gamble. And I know that when he was younger, starting his family and living in the south of France, he would go into Monte Carlo and play the tables. And then one day he just stopped. And then, but you can see that sense of gambler in him when he was in the World War II, putting on shows and risking a lot, including his own life, to try to get some of these things done behind the lines. Do you think that impacted him as a film producer?
Gambling was quite a common habit in Italian cinema in the 40s and 50s. There were a number of filmmakers who were known as regular visitors to the casinos. The director and actor Vittorio De Sica was one. Roberto Rossellini was another. There is a sense that these are people working in an industry where the stakes are high, that you're gambling anyway, that if you're successful, you trust your instinct. So why not take that onto the, roulette table? But it's dangerous. It's dangerous because films can't be made and never have been able to be made without a lot of money. And people in the movies do have a lot of money. And if you take it to the casinos or the roulette table, you know, you risk losing a lot. And I think it's extraordinary that Dino, yes, at a certain point does stop uh, visiting the casinos in the south of France, Monaco, and so on, and realizes that it's not a good thing. Others in Italian cinema at the time didn't manage to do that. I mean, Vittorio De Sica sort of ruined himself more than once and accepted a lot of work on films that were not very good at all, precisely because he needed the cash and he was always out of cash because he was losing it. So Dino is a gambler. You can't be a film producer without having an element of the gambler in you, but at a certain point that becomes, channeled rationally.
But he seemed to put so much trust in the people that were close to him. I really liked that because there was a real sense of family around his sets and around his own personal family. And do you think that influenced any of the story ideas he liked to produce, or just liked being a part of a family as a professional?
Well, it's often thought of as a stereotype of Italian culture, Italian life, that the family is absolutely central. I mean, there are reasons for that. I mean, anthropologists even sort of have studied this element, and it's in part because the state is absent. The systems of support that the people rely on in Italian society have been, and to a large extent still are, largely reliant on family. So there's a huge tradition of family businesses, of families working together, living together, even extended families. And I think Dino De Laurentiis was somebody who liked to trust people. He always prided himself on being straight with people, telling things as they are, giving it to people straight. But when it came to sort of immediate collaborators, he did rely a lot on immediate family, his brother, his children, and indeed sort of more remote family members, all worked with him over a long period. And of course, some of them still carry, the De Laurentiis surname into different sections of the media and broadcasting still today. And I think that we can see as two things. We can see it as being, a sort of fairly typical Italian thing, but we can also see it as something that stems from his desire to transmit to his family members something of his passion for the movies and something of the skills and the techniques that he learned over his long career. And he's clearly somebody who enjoyed being a producer. He used to say, there's nothing else I could do. And that sort of sense of a passion and devotion to his business is something that he clearly communicated to his surrounding family, his own generation and later generations too.
If he were alive today and walked into a classroom to teach producing, what do you think his overriding philosophy would be to impart to the students? Like one or two takeaways?
Well, I think probably he would say, get up early, which is not an easy thing to say to students. But there's an Italian expression, which is, the morning has gold in its mouth, right? The early hours are more valuable than the other hours of the day. And he used to have this habit of getting up at 5:30 in the morning, regardless of, whether it was Christmas Day or a holiday or a, normal working day. And his idea was that those hours before everybody else gets moving are especially valuable. And he often used to set the start of the working day earlier than others. I mean, in Italy, movie making in the 40s and 50s often didn't used to start before midday. He brought it forward. When he made a film in the United Kingdom, he found people arriving at 9 o'clock. He insisted they arrive at 7:30 in the morning. So that sense of, use your time, he would convey. But he often used to set out, the steps that you had to undertake as a producer, which is, selecting the story, approving the script, choosing the director, with the director, sorting out the cast, then approving the final cut, following the post-production, and dealing with everything that took the film to the public, and then finally take responsibility for what happens to it. So these were the steps that he followed. And I think he would set those out. I mean, I imagine he would have been a brilliant teacher, because he has you can just see when you see interviews with him, a great ability to communicate, something that he, kept even to, late in life. And also that sense, something that students always relate to, is he's somebody who fulfilled his dream and who worked off his dreams. He used to say, well, I'm a producer, that's my job, but it's also my hobby. It filled up his entire life. When he didn't used to take holidays when he was involved in a production at all, it was sort of, could even be for 2 years, sort of concentration on a production and nothing else. So that sense of, giving all of yourself, squeezing things to the maximum, I think is something that he would transmit to a young audience.
That's great. I think we have discussed Dino's work quite a lot today.
Okay, great. See you soon, Janet.